I'm Catherine McGrady, the CEO of CNA, and this is CNA Talks.
Welcome to CNA Talks, episode 103. I'm John Stimpson at CNA's Office of Communications. In this episode, a new report from CNA's China Studies program examines the illicit maritime activities of persons, vessels, and corporations tied to the People's Republic of China, aka the PRC. These activities not only violate international law, but also the PRC's policies for how these actors should behave in international waters. But in most cases, Beijing sought to deny or downplay the incidents. To find out more about the gap between the PRC's rhetoric and illicit maritime activity, I sat down with the report's authors. Heidi Holz, a senior research scientist specializing in PRC maritime policies and activities, and Ryan Loomis, a research analyst specializing in PRC actors' behavior in the maritime domain. Here is our conversation. Well, Ryan, Heidi, thanks so much for being here today. It's great to have you.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, John. My pleasure.
And Ryan, I think this is your first time on a CNA Talks.
Yes, it is. It is my first time, though. Fortunately, we've got Heidi here, who's a bit of a pro.
I wouldn't say I'm a pro.
Well, you were with us for the Hong Kong episode, which we did during the protest.
Yeah, it was. That was an interesting time. I think we did one on the Pacific Island countries as well.
I believe you're right. Yeah, I believe that was like December of 2019 before
the world changed.
Yeah. We have you guys on today to talk about your recent report on China's illicit maritime activities. So I wanted to get right into it and ask you, what prompted you to work on this? What was the inspiration for the report?
Yeah, thanks, John. So as you know, CNA does sponsored research and analysis, and this project was ultimately funded by a State Department grant. And what we set out to do was assess the role of the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, in transnational criminal activity. And that's clearly a pretty broad topic, or a broad research question. So before we really got down to it, we did some preliminary research to learn what sort of journalistic reporting, and other data was out there regarding PRC vessels or PRC corporations engaging in bad behavior in the maritime. And after a day of some desk work, it became pretty apparent that PRC illegal activities in the international maritime domain is a widespread and appears to be a persistent problem. I think we found something like 36 or 37 publicly reported instances of illegal fishing, or dumping of pollution, or ramming, engaging in forced labor or human smuggling, tampering with monitoring equipment, and then finally illegal entry and ownership, so prohibited activities or corporate relationships within the exclusive economic zone of a foreign country. So all these legal and regulatory violations in the last 5 years. So that was where we started. We had the research question. We realized that there was a lot of data to work with. And then we got to work. And Heidi, do you want to talk about some of the how we scoped our project?
Yeah, sure, Ryan. So, as Ryan mentioned, there were lots of examples, potential case studies of PRC actors behaving badly in the maritime domain around the world. So we tailored our focus to look at 15 specific case studies, and they all took place within the last 3 years. And they all took place in Southeast Asia, the Pacific Island countries, and Atlantic Africa. And I'm not sure if Ryan mentioned this already, but one of the things that we were particularly interested in was looking at the delta between what the PRC says about the maritime domain and how PRC actors like PRC flag fishing vessels or PRC corporations behave in the maritime domain. So we're looking for a gap between what China says and what PRC actors do overseas. So with that in mind, for each of those 15 cases, we looked at, first we looked at the incident itself to try and figure out as much as we could about the alleged illegal activity carried out by the PRC flagged vessel or the PRC based company. And then we looked at what the PRC had to say about that particular activity, whether there was a response to the incident by, say, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman. And then finally, we looked at what international maritime laws or regulations were violated by that activity to get a sense of how this illegal behavior might be undermining the international system.
Yeah, and just to quickly take a step back there, Heidi, on the point about how China presents its maritime activity, what is the official line from the state? Like before an incident has happened, how do they say their actors behave?
Yeah, and that, I mean, we wanted to know that too. So before we looked at specific cases, we took a step back to try and get a sense of what the PRC's general policies are, their stated policies anyway, about how PRC flagged vessels or individuals should behave in the international maritime domain. And so the four big policies that we boiled it down to are that number one, PRC actors should abide by UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, to which China is a signatory. Two, they should abide by local laws and regional frameworks. Three, the PRC government says that they should combat illegal, unregulated, and unreported, or IUU fishing. Finally, the government says that they should safeguard the maritime environment. In my mind, the most important of these four is number one, the Chinese government says that PRC actors should abide by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea when operating overseas. Under Article 94 of UNCLOS, flag states like the PRC are responsible for a couple things. First, they're responsible for ensuring that vessels flying the PRC flag comply with the maritime laws to which Beijing is a party. And Beijing is responsible for holding violators of maritime laws accountable. So, under UNCLOS, Beijing is really responsible for the behavior of vessels and companies that are operating overseas.
In the reports we ended up producing, both in the case studies as well as in the summary report, we cite specific PRC laws that prohibit all of the illegal behaviors that we observe PRC actors engaging in. And so that is to say, not only do PRC officials or authoritative media make public statements about the policies that Heidi just went over, there are actual laws on the books in China that are designed to back up those policies. And so the issue then becomes there are PRC actors that appear to be contravening the PRC's own laws and doing that persistently.
And right, so with that in mind, it wouldn't be hard for someone to say, well, sure, we've observed these illegal incidents, but these are just rogue actors, right? They're not, necessarily representing the People's Republic of China when they do this. They're operating illegally. So how does China respond when these incidents occur? Like, have any of these actors been held responsible for these actions, for example?
It's a good point, and there's a number of variables at play here. One that we can talk a little bit more about perhaps later is just the sheer size of China's distant water fishing fleet. So you have the largest in the world distant water fishing fleet, plus other PRC flagged vessels, such as research vessels, etc. You just have this incredible abundance of vessels. And so there are going to be some bad actors. But when it comes to the PRC response to bad behavior, call it IUU fishing, of any given PRC flag trawler, etc., we see a couple of different tacks. One is silence. One is Beijing does not acknowledge a case where a third-party country is saying, hey, your vessel is fishing illegally within our exclusive economic zone, our EEZ. We have not given you permission to do that. So one response that we saw is zero response. Beijing does not acknowledge it. The embassy does not acknowledge it. PRC media does not acknowledge it.
And that was fairly common.
Right.
And one way to interpret that is as an effort to kind of downplay the problem.
Right. or hope the problem resolves itself, essentially.
Yeah, it kind of gets swept under the rug. The other types of responses that we saw were outright denial. PRC officials would just deny that there was a problem altogether or that the behavior occurred as described by, local authorities in the country where the incident happened. Another one was to deflect or to even blame the other parties. I believe it was a ramming incident where the PRC vessel had rammed and sunk another vessel and was portrayed as the victim in the situation because they had been swarmed by a bunch of Philippine fishing vessels. So there was this tendency to deflect or to even blame the victims. And then, in a couple instances, but this was, the outlier, PRC officials, acknowledged that an incident took place and was under investigation.
Right. And to go back briefly to the IUU example, so what's the response from Beijing when it's vessels in Gabon or Mauritania or any of the other countries we saw examples of being accused of IUU? Well, we saw at least 4 instances in 2020 alone where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson was asked about some case of IUU fishing, and the response from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is to say that China has a, quote, zero tolerance policy for IUU fishing and rigorously abides by all relevant laws, rules, and norms. And in the same sentence or in the same response, the MFA spokespersons will say, but since you brought up the topic, the US has engaged in X, Y, and Z illegal behavior amongst its fishing fleets. So you see the denial and the counter accusations, usually a number of responses that all are designed to reduce any negative image of PRC's maritime actors.
And that's a really important point to make when thinking about how Beijing responds publicly to these incidents is that Beijing and the ruling Communist Party are very image conscious. They're very concerned about China's international image and minimizing any negative impact of these sorts of activities on Beijing's image. And I think that's largely why you see these types of responses, either to not respond and kind of hope the incident disappears, or to deny it, or to try and deflect blame elsewhere.
And it is interesting that a lot of this seems to happen, and these interactions seem to happen with nations that are far less powerful, less prominent on the global stage than China is. So, particularly when they ignore these incidents, it seems a bit of like a power play. Like, well, sure, you can complain about it, but what actual action is going to happen?
I think you're exactly right. I think that in speaking with stakeholders in some countries, say Ghana, the western coast of Africa, we heard from members of a local canoe fishermen's association who say, we see these things happening. We see PRC vessels coming in and using illegal fishing nets. We see them illegally owning the trawler fleet, and this all negatively impacts our local community. But they don't have the same resources and investigative journalism resources and media footprint in the global media environment to raise the red flag as much as another country like the United States has and could call out bad behavior and make it really apparent. So I think your point is right, John, that these illicit activities on the part of PRC actors are more likely to go on when they are not called out, and they're more likely to not be called out publicly or loudly in the waters of countries who have fewer resources to monitor and report on their environment.
Yeah, that was something that was pretty striking is that when we talk to people, say in Ghana or in Palau, it was really striking how much the illegal fishing and these illegal activities in their EEZs affect their livelihoods, that it's drastically reduced the catch for many local fishermen and fisher folk who really rely on that as their livelihood. And the other thing is that these activities tend to happen in countries that it's not just that they, like Ryan mentioned, that they lack the voice in the international media, but they also lack the basic law enforcement and maritime domain awareness capabilities that allow them to patrol their waters. I think Palau has maybe, I think it was 2 patrol vessels, and they have an enormous EEZ. So the challenge they face is that they don't have the resources to patrol their EEZ and catch the bad actors.
All right, well, we're going to get more into illegal fishing shortly, but first let's take a quick break and then we'll be back with more of our conversation.
Hi, listeners. I'm Nalanthi Samaranayaka, the director of CNA's Strategy and Policy Analysis Program. We study issues ranging from maritime strategy to managing alliances and nuclear policy. We've expanded our work in the past few years to include Arctic strategy and policy analysis and the study of non-traditional security issues, such as women, peace and security, climate change and strategic partnerships, and ocean security. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please check out our webpage, cna.org/strategy.
And we're back. So I wanted to dive into illegal fishing because that seems to be one of the largest areas of incidents that you guys observed. And earlier in the conversation, you guys, I think it was you, Heidi, brought up that China will deflect accusations on the United States. That does raise the question, what makes China unique in this area? Like how are they distinct from other actors in the maritime space?
So the first point I would make about what makes the PRC unique when it comes to IUU fishing or illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing is that there is consensus among every NGO, every research organization that we've found that China is the number one country when it comes to IUU fishing. When I say number one, I mean it is the most frequent offender of IUU fishing. So that's not to say that there aren't other countries whose distant water fishing fleets are engaging in illegal fishing practices, but China is, there's consensus that China is the worst. And so that's why it's important to focus on their distant water fishing fleet.
Yeah, and some of the context for this is that, China has the largest distant water fishing fleet in the world. The estimates of the number of vessels in the fleet vary wildly, but the various NGOs and organizations that have attempted to count are in agreement that China does have the largest distant water fishing fleet in the world, and PRC flagged vessels operate globally.
Right. And even PRC official figures put the count of their distant water fishing fleet at 2,600, which is in and of itself would be the largest. It's notable, though, that all the estimates from other outside organizations put it higher than that. That's one reason that we focused on China and IUU. And then when it came to our own analysis, in the 15 case studies that we built, 5 of those cases ended up being about IUU fishing, where PRC flagged commercial fishing vessels were accused of different types of activities that the UN categorizes as IUU fishing. So whether it's fishing within waters of the jurisdiction of another coastal state without their permission, or engaging in fishing that was not reported or misreported to the relevant country or the Regional Fishery Maritime Organization, or RFMO, or fishing with illegal tackle. Those different types of illegal fishing practices were apparent in 5 out of the 15 case studies we examined.
Ryan, it's probably important to mention too that some of the other types of illegal activities that we looked at, the ramming, going dark by turning off their transponders, the forced labor, those all occurred on fishing vessels as well.
It's a compounding issue.
Yeah.
That's right.
The size of China's fishing vessel, is this like by virtue of, a history of fishing and like it being a big part of their economy, or is it just China's a big country with a lot of people, so they have a lot of fishing vessels?
Well, I can't say for sure, what the historical origins of the large fishing fleet are, but what I can say is that, the PRC government heavily subsidizes its distant water fishing fleet. So, and those subsidies, they artificially increase profits and they result in overcapacity. And so this overcapacity, right? There's more fishing vessels than, say, local fishing grounds can reasonably support. It leads to overfishing, it leads to more congested maritime environment, and it leads to them operating all over the world trying to make a profit.
Okay, so the Chinese government subsidies have inflated the fleet.
Yeah. So I think recent estimates, there was nearly 6 billion in subsidies went to the distant water fishing industry. Not insignificant.
Well, I understand that since you've completed this report, you've actually heard from journalists in the countries that are impacted, specifically Palau, which I believe is a Pacific island nation. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So one thing that became pretty apparent to us once we were speaking with more key stakeholders in the countries that we focused on was that, sure, we were finding lots of examples in media where journalists were covering cases of IUU fishing or of ramming or of pollution. But when we were speaking with these experts during the course of our research, we realized that there's all of these other activities that aren't being reported for untold number of reasons. So we were speaking with a journalist who's based in Palau, and we were kind of going over some of the examples that we were building case studies on. And she brought up the point that, just this last September, they had an instance where a PRC research vessel had come into Palau's EEZ and was carrying out oceanographic surveys within their exclusive economic zone. And that is illegal. That is against the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea to carry out scientific research without the permission of the coastal state within their EEZ. But they don't necessarily have the resources to stop it. This happened 6 weeks ago, and it really hammered home the point that this is going on and on and on. The same journalist, she also noted that, IUU fishing by PRC flagged vessels within Palau's EEZ has been ongoing, at least back as far as 2012, was when Palau authorities started trying to track down some of these PRC fishing vessels that were fishing illegally. And that has been another persistent problem right up through 2021 as well.
Something that I would add, and I know, John, you asked about the illegal fishing, but the example that Ryan just gave, because it was something that demonstrated that the problem is ongoing, was an example of a Chinese government vessel that was illegally conducting a survey in Palau's EEZ. And that's the thing that we haven't mentioned today, is that we've talked a lot about fishing vessels and commercial entities that are behaving illegally in the international maritime domain. But it's an important point that there were instances in which PRC government vessels were engaging in illegal activities as well, and this was one of them.
Sure, and just to rattle off two others, we saw a different PRC research vessel conducting oceanographic surveys with its automatic identification system switched off within Indonesia's territorial waters. So that's one example. And then another example we saw was PRC Coast Guard vessel intentionally ramming Vietnamese fishing vessels, causing them to sink. So yeah, IUU fishing by commercial vessels, huge issue, but PRC official vessels are implicated as well.
And that does completely kind of get away from the argument of like, oh, these are bad actors that are beyond the control of the Chinese state, as soon as the Chinese state is directly involved in the incidents we're talking about, regardless to all the evidence that you guys have gathered, this is something that they are willing to look the other way on when it comes to their commercial fleet.
And to tie it into the South China Sea, in the case of PRC fishing within contested maritime areas within the South China Sea, we observed Philippine media and other South China Sea media reporting on how PRC Coast Guard vessels are basically overseeing PRC fishing activity within the exclusive economic zones of other countries, namely the Philippines, and not only fishing within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, but also using illegal and destructive fishing practices or harvesting practices, such as using chopper boats or explosives to harvest giant clams, which are actually prohibited under PRC law and international law to harvest giant clams because they're a protected species. So you have the PRC Coast Guard overseeing fishing within other countries' exclusive economic zones and using destructive fishing practices at the same time.
One reporter we spoke to in the Philippines also mentioned that those PRC vessels were intentionally keeping local Philippine fisher folk out of those areas as well. So they were denying them access to their fishing grounds.
So, with all of this in mind, is there anything that the international community can be doing about this? Is there any steps that can be taken without, further violating the sovereignty of the nations in question? How can the international community help with this?
I'd start by just saying that the purpose of our research project was to help raise awareness of these issues and to draw attention to this persistent gap between PRC policy and rhetoric about how its maritime actors behave and how some of them are actually behaving. So our objective wasn't necessarily to advocate for a particular course of action. But that said, we do think it is important where possible for coastal states or the international media community to continue to focus on this because of the impact it has on people's lives and livelihoods, from fisher folks' catch being depleted over time due to overfishing to damage caused to the marine environment, which leads to all sorts of bad outcomes. So continuing to shine a light on the issue is one thing that I think is important. Heidi, what do you think?
I would definitely want to think more about the issue before I offered any suggestions about what the international community could do to combat it, because it is such a complicated issue. That said, one thing that would be worth considering when trying to think about response measures would be that the issue is truly global in scale. And I'm afraid that any attempt to address it country by country wouldn't necessarily be effective. For instance, say you help beef up law enforcement capabilities in one particular country along the Atlantic coast of Africa. Well, PRC vessels can learn that, we get caught if we try to fish there. So we'll just, go a couple 100 miles south, and that country doesn't have the resources to patrol their waters, so we can continue engaging in illegal fishing without fear of reprisal. So what stood out to me is that to effectively deal with this issue would probably require at a minimum regional responses, but ideally an international approach to curbing the illegal behavior and holding these fishing vessels and corporations responsible.
Right. Global issues require global solutions.
Yeah.
Well, Heidi and Ryan, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you both so much for coming on.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Definitely our pleasure.
The report is Exposing the Gap Between PRC Rhetoric and Illicit Maritime Activity. It is available in English and in Tagalog, and we'll put a link, the hub page for this research effort, in our show notes. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on CNA Talks. Thanks for listening to CNA Talks. The views expressed are those of the commentators and do not necessarily reflect those of CNA or any of its sponsors. CNA Talks is produced, edited, and mixed by John Stimpson. Our theme music is by Edward Grenga. If you enjoy our show, we'd love if you could give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.